So a little bit of background, as Jack had mentioned earlier as well, in normal times, if I can put it that way, we serve about 400,000 food insecure individuals across the greater Washington area. So our service area covers all of the district, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and then Northern Virginia, Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, Prince William, Manassas. So 400,000 people across the region who are uncertain where their next meal is going to come from. And we do that through a network of about 450 different partner organizations. Many are household names you may have heard of, like Martha's Table, Manna in Montgomery County, Bread for the City, Food for Others, Food and Friends, some, I could go on. And then there are many who are smaller pantries in neighborhoods, many affiliated with or within faith-based institutions around our area. So our goal is really to work through that network because they're in neighborhoods, people feel comfortable going to many of these partners to be able to get their food. In a normal year, through these partners and through some direct distributions, we provide anywhere from 30 to 31 million meals to the community. And so that's on an annual basis. So that's a little bit of how we used to work. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed all of that pretty dramatically. And I'll highlight some of the few things that are different now as we've gone through the last 6 or 7 weeks. Of the 450 partners in our network, less than half are currently open. And in fact, in the very beginning of this pandemic, we were only looking at several dozen, 60, 65 or so that were open right at the beginning. So that was immediately an issue in terms of being able to get the same amount of food, but through a vastly reduced infrastructure that remained open. The second issue, as we all know, is that demand spiked. Typically our clients come to us for 3 to 5 days worth of meals every month. But following the guidance of public health officials and others, people were asked to, stock up and have 1 to 2 weeks worth of groceries on hand. So just with the same number of food insecure individuals, demand went up, threefold and at times more, just so that people could have a week to 2 weeks worth of groceries on hand. At the same time, we had really fewer volunteers who are coming in to support the operations of the food bank, given concern about being out in the public, and we too could only restrict and had to restrict the number of volunteers that we had so that we could maintain social distancing guidelines and minimize exposure for everyone. Another change that we had to move to is, under normal circumstances, we have many partners coming with their vans, with their trucks to pick up food at the food bank and then, take it back to their organizations to be able to deliver it. We switched and had and became just a transportation and delivery only effort, if you will. So our fleet has now been engaged, much more than we typically would with multiple shifts to be able to get food out to our partners. By far the biggest effect for us and what changed the most with the beginning and throughout this pandemic has been the level of food donations. We typically rely on 60% of our food supply coming from retailers and wholesalers. And we saw a very sudden and very dramatic decline, in fact, about a 75% decline in food donations. And some of this and much of this, I think, won't be a surprise to all of you. Retailers can only donate that food if they have it left over, on their shelves and in their stores. And given that the general public was going in and their demand had increased as well, there was really nothing left on those store shelves and in the warehouses to be donated to us. And we also know that the way our regional and national food supply chain is structured, only about half of the food that is produced is actually going to retailers. A good chunk of that, and slightly over half, is going to restaurants. And so that supply chain also had not had a chance to really restructure itself to meet the demand that was now being placed on grocery stores. So the net effect there was a 75% decline in food donations from those who would be primary sources of food donations from us, retailers. And so what that meant is that we had to switch to purchase a whole lot more food than we ever have before. To give you some perspective, in April, we purchased about 100 truckloads of food, and that's 3 times what we purchased the entire last year. and that's just in 1 month. So we're purchasing a lot more. Obviously, that means more financial resources to do so, but it all happened so quickly, that the lead times then started to grow in terms of when we'd actually get that food into the food bank. In the past, when we've ordered a truckload of food, we'd order it and expect it to come in within 8 to 10 business days. Now, the lead times for certain items are up to 8 weeks. And so we are now placing orders for what we hope to have, towards the end of June and July. And so it's caused us just to purchase not just for right now, but also ensure that we've got an adequate food supply for the months ahead. The other changes I'd say are around our clients. So we've had these, 400,000 food insecure individuals who've been hit doubly hard, and I'll sort of come back to the vulnerable being hit even more so than the rest of us in many ways. And then we're also seeing in the last 3 weeks in particular, a huge increase in the number of what we call new clients, so the newly unemployed in our region. And so we're tracking the unemployment claims by county, almost daily when it's provided, daily or weekly. And we're seeing these numbers just skyrocket, just as the rest of you are. So as of a week ago, we saw this in our region, all the counties that we service, about 306,000 newly unemployed individuals. And so we have an algorithm that we work with that helps us translate increases in unemployment to what the increases might be for poverty in the area, and what that translates to then for increases in the number of food insecure. So those are things that we're currently working on. So how have we responded given all of these changes that I just highlighted, both for us as an organization, our network, and our clients? So we began planning early, and I have to say, I didn't think I would ever say the federal government shutdown had its silver linings, but it did. Through that experience that we engaged in last year to support new, individuals who were losing paychecks and in need of food, that helped us really ramp up very quickly in terms of addressing this particular situation. So we were planning in February, and we were already out sort of distributing food in different ways, by early March. So what we've done is created a hub system throughout our region. So there are about 20 hubs. These are larger partner organizations that have the ability to provide much more food than they typically would have. They've got storage capacity, they've got professional staff, a crew of volunteers who are able to get more food out into the community. And so that's partly how we've addressed the closure of much of our partner network. In addition to that, we have also been developing emergency food boxes. And so these are boxes that have 20 to 25 pounds of food, fairly nutritionally balanced across all the categories of protein and dairy and canned fruits and vegetables, things that are not perishable, if you will, in a box, and it supplements a family of 4 for about 3 to 5 days. So we have pivoted to developing and constructing many of these boxes in the spirit of being able to get even more food out into the community in a minimal sort of exposure or low touch, no contact kind of manner. We've already done, I think it's 18,000 boxes or so at this point, and have plans for 20,000 plus boxes over the next month and in subsequent months as well. So that's our approach. Partners who are open are still getting food from us. We've created the hub system on top of that. And yet on top of that, we have these emergency boxes. And in areas that are particularly food insecure and don't have enough hubs or partners, then we are engaging with pop-up distributions in those areas to be able to distribute these boxes of food. Good news is, our service, we typically service about 10,000 seniors in the area. None of that has been interrupted. We've changed our operations to a lot more delivery versus pickup. We've engaged actually DC taxi drivers and Uber drivers and others as ways to be able to get food to seniors who may, have previously been somewhat challenged as well, but even more so challenged in getting their food today. Our service for kids has also continued. Many of you have heard about the breakfast and lunch programs that are taking place in different schools in our area. We have been a big provider of the after school meal. And so, and that is usually a hot meal. So we've had to change that to make that a grab and go meal, but we're providing that across the region as well. We work so closely with, Martha's Table in the district, Manna in Montgomery County, with Prince George's County, the executive and her team in Prince George's to work with the school districts, and we're doing the same in Virginia as well. We've also managed to maintain a very dedicated fleet of volunteers who come in with masks, with gloves, and standing 6 feet apart to be able to continue to support much of the packing of boxes that I just spoke about, but also some of the distributions that are taking place in the community. And so we're very thankful to have that dedication to come through as well. So as we look to the future, we are now very clear that this is not just an acute, 3-month scenario that was more of a sprint perhaps for us, but this is a marathon. We're going to be engaging in this new model with some variation for the next 12 months plus. Obviously, we're very concerned about the growing unemployment, and we're projecting about a 20% increase in food insecure in our community over the next year. So to put that in perspective, we already have around 400,000 food insecure individuals. And so this would be 70, 80,000 additional individuals who are going to find themselves food insecure this coming year. So we are projecting that. We are budgeting to continue to purchase a lot more food. We're so thankful to have close relationships with all of the retailers in our area. And many of them highlight and suggest to us that their donations to us are not likely to go back to normal until much later this year, November, December timeframe. So for the next 6 to 7 months, we will continue to purchase at a significant level. And I'm sure I mentioned this earlier, but typically our donations from food banks each month in terms of food, rather from retailers, is worth about $2 million. So $2 million worth of food is donated to us by these retailers. And so we're anticipating that 75% decline through the end of this calendar year. We do think, though, that it's important as we look to recovery in our region. There's much that we need to and can do a bit better as we try to pave this road towards recovery. DC and the greater Washington region, as so many of you know, has not been, an equitable area, if you will, in terms of great disparities between those who have and those who have not. We've certainly focused on this quite a bit, and we've seen that, and I think many of us know this, the top 20% of households in DC have 29 times more in terms of income and wealth, than the bottom 20%. In Virginia, we see something similar as well. And there's a huge discrepancy in life expectancy, within a 10-mile radius within our area as well. Ward 8, you see individuals with a life expectancy of 62 to 63 years, whereas in Friendship Heights, in DC, that's 96 years. So that's a substantial difference that really characterizes the level of inequity in our region. So we believe strongly there's an opportunity to rebuild and to rebuild in a more equitable manner through public-private partnerships that involve the counties, the district, many of the corporate actors who've already shown their willingness to engage in very innovative ways. And we think we'll need to do this as we move forward. So I'll conclude by just saying that, I want to thank so many of you on the phone, your companies, you as individuals, those who have foundations, et cetera, have supported and have been so generous right from the beginning. There's no way we would have been able to pivot and be as nimble as we've been able to without that generous support and confidence in us, our network, and our ability to be able to provide food to those in need. In particular, I'd like to say Mars, Bank of America, Giant, Safeway, they've all really stepped up in significant ways. And there's so many others. So I was given a time limit, so I won't go through the whole list here. But I do want to just say our community has been generous and does support those in need, especially during these very difficult times. But this is a marathon. And so it will be a resource intensive effort over the next 12 months for us to continue to purchase, box, deliver in various different forms food to those in need. So I would encourage everyone to continue to partner, and we will continue to think innovatively about different ways that we can partner so that, the food bank can support from a food perspective, but also be at the table for lots of the economic discussions that are coming up in terms of how we rebuild and how we rebuild in a manner that allows for greater resiliency across a broader range of our population. So let me stop there. I know there'll be questions later, and turn it over to Margaret.
Thanks so much, Radha. And thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to follow Radha because thanks to Radha's leadership, the Capital Area Food Bank has really led an unbelievable effort to keep DC families fed. And it's been incredible to see just how quickly they've mobilized and changed really all of their plans on a dime across the multiple phases of their work. So to give a little bit more background on my role, I co-lead the Good Food team at Arabella Advisors, which is a philanthropy consulting firm. And we advise some of the largest foundations in the DC area and the US on their charitable giving strategies related to hunger, nutrition, and sustainable food systems. So right now I'm working with my foundation and individual clients that are responding to COVID by doing things like funding frontline organizations that are keeping food on families' tables, like the food bank. I also co-facilitate the Washington Regional Food Funders, which is a group of foundations and individual donors focused on healthy food access in DC. And I know there's significant overlap with this group, so some of you may be familiar with that work. So I want to zoom out for a moment and talk about the impact of COVID on the food system more broadly, all across the supply chain. So of course in DC and across the US, we're seeing food system disruption really at two levels is how we're thinking about it with our clients. So one is food access, and that's what Radha went into great detail on in terms of keeping families fed. And the other is supply chain relief. So that's keeping the food supply chain running. And I'll walk through both of those challenges and talk a little bit about the response we're seeing from nonprofits, business, and government, both in DC locally and at the federal level. So in terms of keeping families fed, of course, the food bank is at the center of everything in DC in terms of emergency food access. And they're working with the other organizations that are feeding families, as Radha went into, including schools and shelters. And, in a normal school day, US schools will serve 30 million free and reduced lunches to students. And so with schools shut down, it's just left an enormous gap. And many school districts in the DMV are offering free pickup meals for students, or many of them are offering free pickup meals for any child in the district, whether or not they're enrolled, and some are even extending those meals for their families, which those schools are not going to be reimbursed by the federal government for. Of course, organizations are focused on the communities most impacted by COVID, including seniors, those that are immunocompromised, and especially communities of color who, due to structural inequality, face higher rates of diet-related disease and food insecurity that make them more susceptible to COVID. Radha, of course, touched on home delivery, and there's an unprecedented need there to deliver food to folks' homes, and we'll continue to see that. And a large infrastructure challenge there. But we're seeing lots of creative solutions on that front, like Radha's team, switching their plans and really rolling out a delivery infrastructure, and other nonprofits that are working with rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft to do that last mile delivery that they're just not set up to do. In terms of the federal policy response for food insecurity, the individual stimulus will help with this, but only in the short term. The bigger piece is the increase in unemployment benefits by $600 a week for those that are unemployed, but of course will still be tough for families that are already living paycheck to paycheck on their full salary. We haven't seen Congress increase the size of SNAP payments yet. They've increased the funding for SNAP, which is previously known as food stamps, to help cover the increased demand for that program, but the payment size for SNAP is still the same. But we are seeing the online SNAP program being rolled out in many states, including DC, which is an exciting development. That's a new program that has been pretty slow to get off the ground, but the government has fast-tracked to allow more people to access groceries that can't easily get to a grocery store, either because they live in they don't live in close proximity to a grocery store, or unable to go for a variety of reasons. And this is one hopeful instance where we're seeing government move a lot faster than normal to respond to COVID. And the other piece, in terms of the real food system challenges, is supply chain relief. So that's keeping the food supply chain running and responding to and supporting businesses that have closed or have seen a huge dip in their customers. So in terms of supply chain infrastructure, with restaurants closed, half of the places where we're used to purchasing our food have shut down, and that has created a real strain for farmers and food businesses further up the supply chain that are still open but have lost their customers. They were selling to restaurants, hotels, and schools, and we saw this challenge first materialize, of course, in items being out of stock in the grocery store. That magic of our food magically arriving in the grocery store down the street has disappeared, and that's not because there's a shortage of anything in, at least in terms of food in the US. It's because grocery stores have had to respond to the huge increase in demand that they've seen, as well as panic buying, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And it's just taken the food supply chain time to adjust to the change in volume across different channels as grocery stores are taking in so much more of that volume and demand. And as Radha mentioned, that's impacting organizations like the food bank that rely on grocery store donations, and will continue to play out over the coming months. And now, the most recent development is we're seeing major meat processing plants that are shutting down after hundreds of their employees, working in close quarters are getting sick, especially a challenge with pork and chicken plants. It's a challenge, with consolidation in those industries that are leaving a whole pork industry in a state, for instance, without a processing plant. We are seeing, creative solutions on this front as well. For instance, there's a food delivery business in DC called 4P Foods that has mobilized a coalition that's sourcing food directly from local farms, working with nonprofits to package those local foods into meals and grocery bags, and then serving as last mile delivery to get those meals to pickup sites and homes. For instance, they're packaging grocery boxes and then passing them off to the National Guard to distribute to homes in DC. So we're seeing some good nonprofit business and government collaboration there. And then, of course, in addition to keeping the open businesses like grocery stores and other, businesses that are open on a partial basis running, there's the question of relief for the businesses that are shut down or further up the supply chain that have lost their customers. So, we touched on farms and the losses that farms have faced when their customer businesses have shut down or they're unable to sell directly to consumers through farmers markets. And Congress has passed almost $10 billion in relief for farms, and the White House has announced another $19 billion in farmer package relief, which will be a help, but to be honest, is likely to only skim the surface in terms of the potential loss we may see from farms. And then in terms of food businesses, of course, there's the Paycheck Protection Program, and which the Senate added $310 billion in additional funding to last week. Some food businesses in particular are having challenges with that program, not only with getting access to those loans, but for businesses like restaurants who can't take advantage of the forgivable aspect of the loan because of requirements around keeping employees on payroll. So I know restaurants and similar businesses are pushing for either a change in those loan terms or a different program to provide more appropriate relief for restaurants. I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, and so I want to end with a few reasons I see to be hopeful, especially in this region. And I've touched on how impressive it's been to see how resilient our regional food system is already, how much really solid nonprofit infrastructure there is with the food bank at the helm, and how quickly they've mobilized and really kept some of their smaller partners afloat and able to get food to the communities they serve. How restaurants and food businesses have stepped up and are working with government and nonprofits for creative solutions to keep families fed. And we're also seeing farmers that have gotten creative in selling directly to consumers. And so I suspect we'll see longer term shifts there in not only people's understanding of where their food comes from, but where they'll be purchasing it in the future. And I see a great opportunity not only to recover from this, but echoing some of Radha's remarks, there's an opportunity to build our food system back better and to fix some of those supply chain gaps that have been there all along, but this pandemic has really exposed. And so to make our region even more resilient to be able to respond to the next crisis. So I'll leave it there, and then I think we're opening up for questions.
Thank you, Margaret and Radha. That was great. We will open for questions. So please use the question to answer feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. I do have a few that we can get started with right now. First question. Thank you for your presentations. Most helpful and informative big and little picture information. I'm excited to see the USDA CFAP program taking shape. To what degree do you feel this program will alleviate additional expenditures the food banks are experiencing due to reduced donations? And to what degree will it assist farmers fiscally, both big and small operations?
I'm happy to take that first, Margaret, and maybe address the food bank part of it. So thank you for that question. Yes, this is the CFAP, the Coronavirus Farm Assistance Program, or Food Assistance Program, as some people are saying, because it's really two sides of the same coin, helping farmers and helping food banks as well get food to those most in need. So the way that program is structured, there are three different components to it. So there's boxed produce that will be available. So purchased from farmers, boxed, and then provided to food banks for us to be able to provide to those in need. So there's produce in one category, there's protein, and we understand that to be chicken and pork, in another category. And then dairy, there's either just a fluid milk box or a mixed dairy box that one can get. So the process in which that's, and Margaret mentioned this earlier, this is part of, the packages that Congress had released. And so we know that national food distributors will be putting in bids with the USDA by Friday this week, I believe. And then we have been engaging with many of these national and regional distributors to highlight how much food, how much dairy, how much produce, how much meat we would be able to get and distribute, for the next 7 months. So this is a program that runs through end of December. So we have done our calculations, shared that with various distributors, but there is a bidding process. So we won't know until probably middle of May which distributors won for which regions, and it could be a distributor or multiple, for produce, dairy, meat. So some of those things are still a little bit up in the air, but the answer is yes, it will alleviate certainly what we're counting on from private donations to be able to provide good, healthy food to those in need. But we won't know the exact numbers yet, I think for a few weeks and possibly for a month or so. We do know that the produce will be fantastic. In fact, most of our orders that we've put in or suggestions that we've put in have been heavy on the produce, a little bit lighter on the meat because we understand that to be pre-cooked, potentially things like filling for tacos and chicken nuggets and things like that. And pork is not a big, of all the meats, that's not the one that's high demand, if you will, in our region. So we've gone a little bit conservative in terms of the meat. And dairy, we've asked a lot of questions, size of, the milk, the amounts of cheese, those types of things. It's hard for a family to have 25 pounds, of dairy and to be able to use that appropriately and not result in a lot of, wastage as well. So on the dairy front, we've also been a bit conservative in terms of what we have requested, just because we're also uncertain size of the milk and things like that. And the other thing with dairy and with meat is that we have to ensure that our partners have sufficient cooler and freezer storage capability. Obviously, we'll keep quite a bit of it here and try and provide it just in time for distributions. But those are some factors that we have to take into account when we're placing orders as well. And the other factor is just to get a sense of how frequently this will be delivered to us, and obviously if it is increased with increased frequency, we're able to take more because it will come in and go out fairly quickly. But if we have to, keep quite a bit of it on hand, if we only get a shipment once a month or, or something like that, then that results in a different level of demand. So bottom line, it will be very helpful. It's absolutely required. And I'm glad that USDA is looking to jumpstart this and get it moving as early as the end of May. But the details are still being worked out.
And happy to add in on the farm side, in terms of the CFAP program, I think it's exciting on two levels. One is in terms of the additional funding it's providing for farmers, which is supposed to be $16 billion in direct support for on-farm losses. I also think it's exciting because the program is really a systems level response. It's not a piecemeal solution for different challenges. It's connecting farmers to the nonprofits that are serving the consumers that need the food. So really killing multiple birds with one stone there.
Thank you. Next question. Are you tracking looming concerns about farmers, producers dumping or abandoning production out of concern about supply chain issues? Is there a fear that this is a local issue, or is this a national issue with the hard to predict impact?
Yeah, happy to talk to this. And while I'm not an ag economist, this is definitely something that we're tracking. I'd say this is a national issue. It's not something that is that's just occurring in the DC area. I'd say it's a bigger issue in places like the Midwest, the Heartland, where stemming from meat and other processing plants shutting down, when farmers don't have a direct place to sell their food into, that's when we're seeing the on-farm losses and things like milk getting dumped, when milk processing plants are shutting down, or when the distributor isn't buying as much of that food because they're selling directly to schools and hotels that are shut down. I expect this will be a shorter term. Seeing this at a large scale will be a shorter term implication of COVID, and that as businesses start to reopen, or longer term as the supply chain shifts more to more farmers and distributors being able to sell directly into grocers and the businesses that are still open, we'll see less of that. But it's hugely concerning for farmers that won't be able to recover those losses, and hopefully we'll be able to benefit from some of the USDA funding allocated for things like that.
Thanks, Margaret. Next question for Radha. How do you see public-private partnerships evolving to better address growing food insecurity issues?
Actually, public-private partnerships have a huge role to play in how we recover from this and how we recover in a more equitable manner. I'll give you an example of how we're working with Prince George's County right now. The county executive is actually taking a very lead and strong role in how she wants to address food insecurity, not just in the next couple of months, but over the next year plus. And so they are relying on us for a lot of the data, that we have in terms of hunger hotspots in the community, looking at the increase in number of food insecure, where they're likely to be, layering on top of that channels of distribution and how we might reach those individuals, and then highlighting potentially where some gaps might be in terms of access and reach. And so she's taking, and her team taking that information and then looking at what they can do, both from an allocation of funds to purchase more food to be able to help meet that need, but also looking at policy changes that they are either ones that they can affect at the local level or that they can work with the state and federal government around. So Margaret mentioned earlier that there hasn't really been an increase, in food stamps, and being able to even have a 15% or a 20% increase will allow individuals not just to rely on the food bank and its network, but also to just have more money when they go to the grocery store, to be able to purchase food. So there are different things that I think can be done that way through a partnership with the public sector. She just last week or 2 weeks ago now, also with that data, encouraged all of the private businesses that are in Prince George's County to really come together and say, these are individuals who are not able to get food. They're not likely then to, without the nutritious food, they won't be as healthy. They're not a good workforce for you, if you will, in the future. And so there's a role that the private sector can play by supporting, with either financial resources or other assets, whether that's supply chains, warehouse facilities, transportation, other assets that can be brought to the table to help accelerate the improvement, within the local Prince George's County economy, if you will. And that generated lots of interest. I mean, that's Bank of America stepped up and said, we'll support with $500,000 going to Prince George's County to be able to support efforts there as their contribution in getting the county and individuals up and running again. So there are lots of different ways that we can think through how to engage various different sectors and the parts of the economy to be able to have a more sustainable effect. One other example I'll just throw out, talking about farmers earlier, we are a large purchaser from many of our local farms, when the growing season is in effect here. And we purchase a good chunk of our produce that we provide for free from local area farmers. This year, we will not only obviously continue to purchase and maybe even purchase more, but we have to have that extra step of boxing all of this produce as well to make it easy to distribute. So that also could provide opportunities, volunteers or a paid workforce, that is coming in to be able to help us box this produce to be able to get it out to those in need. So lots of different ways, I think, that we can engage across all three sectors for sustainable impact.
Thanks, Radha. Do you have any idea how the farmers will connect with nonprofits under the USDA COVID program?
I'm happy to tackle this, but might ask a clarifying question here. So this might be referring to two different aspects of the USDA's response. So one's the CFAC program that Radha and I were just discussing. And so those funds will go to farmers directly. Farmers can apply for or connect with their local food bank. I'd say through in terms of connecting with farms, if they're asking about farms that might be struggling because they lost their customers, I have some more specific ideas for connecting with farmers on a local level. So I'd be happy to have a follow-up with that person directly to talk about some specific ideas.
Thanks, Margaret. Next question. You mentioned looking at unemployment data to get a sense of what future demand will be. Are there any information challenges that you are facing where having better data would be helpful for planning or response?
It's a great question. We are right now able to get information by county and not necessarily at the census tract level. And most of our work is done at the census tract level. So we've actually just started to make the outreach to different counties to just get a sense of whether we can get a little bit more granular data. So we don't just project at a county or, in the case of the district, at the entire district level, but we start to look at wards and we start to look at neighborhoods in different counties. So that's the type of data that we would like to overlay on our hunger heat map as we determine sort of new hunger hotspots that might be emerging. And then basically our next step would be to then better understand who's there from a partner perspective who might be able to service that region. Otherwise, we will look to set up a hub if it's large enough an area, or direct distributions, the various kind of pop-up types of efforts that we do. So I think right now getting more granular data beyond at the county or district level would be very helpful.
And I just add there a kind of higher level point of, we're working with clients that are supporting food banks across the US. And so some insight into response in other cities as well. And the analytical rigor that Radha and her team have brought to the response in terms of grounding their response in the different phases in the data that's available is really state of the art and as good as anything, we're seeing across the US.
Thank you both. Margaret, can you expand on your ideas of how we can build back better after this crisis related to our food system?
Sure, and we could have a whole separate webinar on this. So I'd love to follow up with this person directly. I'd say I have, ideas across the whole food system. One is changing the programs to support farmers, and especially, seeing the impact of COVID on smaller and family farms that really don't have access to some of those larger USDA subsidy programs is near the top of my list. Another is looking at consolidation in the supply chain. And I think there's the potential for this pandemic to lead to a rejuvenation of regional food systems, which tend to be more resilient because of the shorter supply chains in times of crisis. And so ways that we can support farmers selling directly to consumers, or more sourcing of local produce, and strengthening those connections between local farmers, local businesses, and nonprofits like Radha and her team, who already do have those strong connections, so that we can be better prepared next time. As well as building some more of the supply chain infrastructure and the coordination necessary really to respond to the next crisis, like having a last mile distribution system in place and already set up. But if you're interested in discussing that further, I'd be happy to.
If I could just add a couple of things to, Margaret had a great list of things, and I know that Arabella has so much more given their insight into this area that they can offer. I would just add two more things. I think what could have helped us here, which we want to keep in mind as, for future, unfortunately for future events, as they occur. I think, USDA has been good, but could have moved a little bit faster in relaxing some of the guidelines on certain programs. We as food banks have, lots of different types of food, if you will, that we have at our warehouse at any given point in time. 20% of our food is food provided by the USDA, and that's usually targeted to specific populations. And so if in the onset of this pandemic, we had been able to relax those guidelines a little bit sooner than we ultimately have been able to, it would have just freed up a lot more food that could go out to those in need. So I think that's one learning that I think will be helpful as we move forward. I think the second thing is, as a food bank, we've tried under normal circumstances, if you will, to ensure close contact with various emergency operating teams, in the district and across different counties. But those meetings are they're good, but we're not always at the table. And I think that's important going forward. I think we're going to be pushing to be at the table sooner in normal times before an emergency hits, so that we're all clear about how we can engage as quickly as possible during that point in time, and we're better aligned. An example I'll give you here is that we've been asked now by several counties, for procurement of food. Governments don't typically procure food, and so we are more, we're able to do that in a more nimble manner. But by the time we went through all the contracting processes and what needed to be done, it was sort of 3.5 weeks into the pandemic, and then the lead times just grew longer and longer for food to come in. And so I think having clear procedures about, when something hits, who are all the actors and what will we just immediately do, under the assumption that other things will follow, I think would have helped us and is a key learning from this episode.
Thank you both. At the Board of Trade, we talk a lot about the phase after recovery, which we're calling renewal, as an opportunity to bounce back stronger and to get a more robust and equitable economy than we had before. What would you like to see in that new and improved economy? What opportunities for change and growth are there from your perspective?
Happy to take that first, Radha.
Sure.
I think I touched on this a bit in terms of my response for building the food system back better. One point that I'm really hoping that more, especially on the nonprofit and business side, but also in terms of general social consciousness, that we'll be paying attention to is how this pandemic has impacted different communities more than others, and what we can do in the meantime to reduce the impacts of structural inequality for communities of color, undocumented communities, seniors, and others that are facing higher rates of diet-related disease, lower access to grocery stores, and and higher rates of comorbidities that have really made this pandemic a lot more challenging for certain communities. And so things like food access and access to healthcare and how those two compound, I hope will be a huge point of the solution in terms of taking an equity lens.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with everything Margaret said. The only couple of things I would add to that would be that we look at recovery in a in a continuum. So as we're talking about, for example, greater attention to food access, good nutrition, healthcare, technology. I mean, all of these things are important, and and they're nexus issues. They affect one another. But as we look to those things, we shouldn't look at it just from okay, how do we have more grocery stores or different, formats and models of grocery stores in certain locations? Very important, but we shouldn't, and we need to get there, but we shouldn't stop there. We should also think about, so what happens after that, with access to better food that enables healthier lifestyles. And so how can we then ensure that those healthier individuals have better job training, that is accessible to them. So looking at all of the steps that allow them to become much more part of the mainstream economy in our region, and so that they don't remain on the sidelines. I feel like clearly we all know there are those who are in the middle, and there are those who are sort of watching, if you will, from the periphery. And we need to address the various issues that will strengthen the individuals who right now are at the periphery, but then create those pathways, create those bridges, and think of it as a continuum. So people don't fall off the cliff at different points, but there's really a continuum of many different actors who are coming together, not just focused on food security, not just focused on health, or just focused on skill and workforce, but how all of those have to work together to be able to help people in their journey, towards greater engagement and greater self-sustainability as well. So I think all of those coming together will be important. I'm really excited actually that Jack and the team at the Board of Trade have started, have been thinking about this and have started to pull together an economic recovery task force in the region. And from what I can see, I'm thrilled that, the food bank and I'm on it, and it seems to be the right collection of different individuals, organizations that can speak to these various parts of the continuum that I just referenced. So I think it's efforts like that aren't led by a few with the assumption that it will help others, but are really much more inclusive in their own approach, and the voices that will be at the table, I think, will go a long way then in ensuring a better recovery for our region.
Thank you both. What are your priorities in the next 6 months to a year as we start to reopen and heal our economy?
I'm happy to start with that. We've been doing a lot of thinking about the next 14 months. We're looking at it as the next 2 months as, a continuation of the more intense period, if you will, especially as it relates to the pandemic. We're looking at this with two, curves that we've sketched on our whiteboards here. One is the trajectory of the pandemic, and the other is the trajectory and the impact of the economic slowdown. And so we're looking at both of these curves, where they might intersect, when they're both high, when one might be higher, one might be lower, et cetera, in terms of its impact. So that's how we're able to then look at what the food insecure population would look like and what the needs are month by month. And so as we look at this, we are taking into account what Margaret mentioned earlier, the unemployment checks and the additional $600 that people are getting. That comes to an end at the end of July. And right now there is nothing that suggests, that it will continue moving forward. So we are modeling our efforts, taking into account the fact that there's an immediate need now, and that will continue for the next 2 months. So our priorities for the next 2 months, as I mentioned, we're continuing to order food, looking at which partners can be up and running again in the network, different areas that we may need to have pop-ups as we see more individuals, still dealing with the pandemic, and as we see this increase, if you will, in those who are unemployed. For us, the economic slowdown piece has a greater impact on what we're doing probably from August onwards. That's when we see the reduction of these what I'm calling bonus, the $600 bonus. And so we will see people, even more, I don't want to use the word despair, but even more in need, at that point for food. And so we're projecting a dramatic increase in demand, likely from August through to, next spring or so. And then the variable here is the pandemic in the fall, and sort of whether that comes back, in a resurgent manner or not. But we do know that with social distancing in place, probably for the remainder of the year, the way we do our direct distributions, and our direct distributions look like farmers markets, the only difference being that people stand up in line, before the market opens, usually for an hour plus, because they're worried there won't be enough food. And so that we have 250 people standing, at any one of these direct distributions. Clearly, how we orchestrate those direct distributions will have to change. They're 6 feet apart. We're not going to be able to have 250 people together in one area. We're likely to box a lot more, bag a lot more. So our operations, the shift that we've just gone through, I think will continue to stay with us through a good portion of the year. But really for us, the variables are, the curve and trajectory that the pandemic will take. We think a little bit of a reprieve from what we're hearing this summer, but then potentially a spike again. But the economic slowdown becomes, a bigger impact from late summer onwards. And the last thing I'll say is schools and when schools start, and all of that. We're also looking at several different scenarios. Many of our direct distributions are at schools. When parents come to pick up their kids, they can get 40, 50 pounds of groceries often at that point. Again, we'll have to structure those differently. And some may not be sites, some may be sites, and we have to think then about home deliveries and things like that if we're not able to congregate as many people to be able to get the food that they need. So to sum it up, it's a lot more ordering of food. When we started, we thought in February, well, let's order an extra truckload of food. That's only 30,000 pounds. And by the end of 4 weeks, we had ordered 3 million pounds, more of food. So one thing is for certain, we'll be ordering a lot more through the end of the year. And then we'll obviously wait to see how the USDA CFAP program rolls through, and that might provide a little bit of a reprieve as well.
Thanks, Radha. And I'd echo, everything that that Radha said. And it's hard to think 6 months out at this point, but we are really paying attention to the economic downturn and whether that will lead to a longer term downturn for farmers foremost, and then food businesses as well that may not reopen. And Radha said, from the get-go, we knew that this wouldn't be a sprint, but it's a question at this point of whether it's more of a 10K or a marathon in terms of what rebuilding looks like, and what how quickly the economy and the folks that keep it running can really recover. I'd say in terms of advocacy, we're focused on keeping the drumbeat for ensuring access to SNAP benefits and loan access and farm relief access for businesses and farms, especially those that aren't able to reopen as quickly as most. And then we're thinking about this unique moment where Americans are paying attention to where their food is coming from now more than they have in recent history, and how we can be thinking about innovating in response to some of the new openings from this pandemic, and opportunities to connect farmers and nonprofits and businesses that are working together, and keep funneling support to those efforts to make our food system more resilient.
Thank you both. One or two questions before we close out for this morning. What COVID-19 innovations have you found useful on the operations side in facilities for preparation and distribution?
Sure. There are several innovations, I think, on our front. We have used our, this gets down to brass tacks, but, we've used conveyor belts before to be able to, get the process rolling and boxes being built. And so I think we've learned a lot in terms of how to maximize efficiency, given we've had fewer numbers of people who are able to volunteer and support, and a lot more food that needs to be boxed. We box about 2,000 boxes a day, and so there's lots of innovation around just the process and things like that we've seen. The other is just how we have worked really well with our private sector partners. So whether that's and it's been a lot in the transportation space, I would say, whether that's deliveries and support and engagement with Uber, Lyft, DC taxi drivers, as I've mentioned earlier, how we can all come together and getting food to individuals while, really ensuring privacy as much as possible, ensuring the social distancing that we need, and resulting in impact in getting food to those in need. I think collaboration, I mentioned a learning where we could do this a little bit faster and better in the future, but it's only been 6 weeks and we're already collaborating, far better than we had right at the beginning of this with public authorities as well as with the private sector, and being able to bring in specific assets that the private sector has in addition to monetary resources to be able to help, further our efforts across the board as well. I have to say, something else that worked really, really well is Kathy Merrill, who runs the Washingtonian magazine, early on reached out and said, I know that this is going to be a long haul. You guys are going to need extra support. As a media entity, I'm going to reach out to all the other media entities, in the region to be able to just highlight, what the needs are, what you're doing, and just having some airtime. This wasn't at all about financial donations, but just having some airtime dedicated to sharing what the need was and what we are going to continue to be doing would be helpful just to keep the community informed. And she did that, and almost every single major media outlet through various channels of digital as well as in print and paper came together to enable that for our community. And I think these are just examples of so many innovations, only a fraction of which originated with us, so much originated elsewhere, but in support of our community and the needs that those who are more vulnerable face. So I think there's been really lots of good innovation stories, positive partnerships that have come about in this very trying time.